In this video, we are going to let out the waist on this suit pant. Taking in the waist is one thing on a pair of pants because you can kind of keep going in and in and in until it starts to mess with other, like the side pockets and areas of the pant. Let outs are different because we only have the fabric that we have. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the center back seam. So if we're looking at the pant from the front, the center back seam is directly inside, and looking at either side of that seam, we can tell that we have quite a bit of seam allowance. So this is great. This is the perfect candidate for letting out. What we can also judge is that we've got, let's say, almost 2 inches here, but keep in mind that we need to have enough seam allowance to actually hold that seam together. So what does that mean? I would say we have almost 1.5 inches of room to let this pant out for this customer. So great news, we are good to get opening up this waist. As a side note, we also have a video for taking in a waist, so making it a little bit smaller. Check that video out over here. Okay, back to the let out. Here we are ready to seam rip. So I'm gonna lift up this little seam allowance and take a look here. Instead of the waistband being tacked down to the seam allowance, which is common, this is the other most common way that the waistband is fastened, is there's actually a stitch running all the way along the entire waistband. Let me flip to the outside and show you that you can't see it, which is great. That's the point. So we call this a stitch in the ditch. We've got a ditch here, which is the waistband and the seat and a seam line there that connects that waistband. And we, if you can just barely see, we are going to replace that stitch as the last step to this process, which means it's the first step now. So let's open that up so that we can gain access to that internal waistband. And I'm just going to pull these sections apart and gently seam rip. We got to be really careful with a pattern like this where we've got, I love the blue, I love the checkered style pattern, but we want to make sure that we're cutting only seams and not cutting any holes in the fabric. Alrighty. And I'm going to cut all the way to the beginning of where the pocket bags are stitched. So you've got typically 2 back pockets on a suit pant, and their pocket bags are going to be right inside here. So we're just going to seam rip until we get to the beginning of that attachment. You'll also see an interesting little detail in here, which are these little paper tags. This is super common in production. This would have been a way that they might have labeled certain pieces of the pant during the production in the factory. Those have no significance to us now and actually can burn if you iron them later. So we're just going to peel those off and trash those. Those have no use for us. All right, now check this out. Beautiful. So this allows us to access the entire waistband, internal, external, and the seat. So again, I'm going to flip this to the outside. This is what it looks like finished. Releasing this hidden seam, you can actually see the other side of it as I pull it off there. Cool. And now we have just flipped up the internal waistband so that we can access this full continuous seam. That is what we're letting out. All right, let's fold this up and press those seam allowances together. And now we're ready to start looking at how much we want to let that garment out. Let's grab our chalk and our ruler. As we're looking at how much we want to let the garment out, let's revisit the measurement from the right side. If we would like to let this garment out 1.5 inches, let's say, what we need to do is take half of that measurement from the seam on the inside because it will be on the double. What does on the double mean? It means that when we push these seam allowances together with the seam in the middle, if we let out the garment 3/4 of an inch right here. In total, we are actually letting it out 3/4 of an inch on either side of this seam, making it ultimately 1.5 inches bigger. Make sense? The good news is, if it doesn't make sense, you will find out from experience how this works. So just keep following along and we will get there. So let's lay our ruler down. Again, we're going to be letting this garment out 1.5 inches. So we are going to mark right at our 3/4 inch line. And we can use the chalk here when we're working on the darker interfaced portion. But as we get down into the seat, that gets a little bit trickier because we've got this beautiful checked blue pattern that makes the chalk a little bit harder to see, as you can tell. So we're going to switch over and use our pins to make this a little bit clearer. All right, now, very, very important detail. You are looking at the internal waistband up here, external waistband here, and right across here is your waistband seam. This is where the waistband is connected to the seat. So waistband, seat. The reason that matters is because when we are going straight through the waistband, this portion must be exactly parallel to the original stitching. So you can't do a little bit more here and a little bit less there. If you try to slant this seam going through the waistband at all, it will make everything wonky later. So when we get down into the seat, we are going to be merging it in gently on a curve, just like the seat of our pants. But up here with the waistband, because this internal section flips down into that external section, those two have to be exact perpendicular mirrors of each other. So we're going to make a parallel line right now that we're going to follow. Put a couple of pins through there. One other important detail here is you'll notice I am not seam ripping that original seam. I am actually going to use that original seam stitching to hold everything in place for me while I'm marking and pinning and even sewing. Then, once I've got a new line stitched in, I will release this stitching last. That gives me more structure and kind of helps me keep all of these seams in line. That's one other thing. We've got a seam here at the top of the waistband, a seam here at the bottom of the waistband. There's a couple of seams that we really want to match up because not only does it look good, but it's important for the structure and the fold of the waistband. So we're going to keep all the little help and support that we can. Now, that's enough of a line for me to get started. I'm going to jump over to the sewing machine and get sewing. All right, let's get lined up here. I'm going to take my pins out as I go. And again, I've got my seam allowance on one side and the rest of the entire pant over here on this side. And I'm going to use all of my fingers kind of spread out to keep everything smooth and keep the seam allowances, the pant from getting tucked up under my needle, and just in general feed this really evenly into the machine. I'm also keeping an eye on my original stitching over here to the left. That's going to help me stay parallel because again, staying parallel with this new stitching line is extremely important. We're not going to do any veering off of this line until we get under the waist seam and into the seat. All right. And I lift my presser foot like that just to kind of reorient myself. Perfect. And now as we're getting down into the seat, I also like keeping this original stitching for the purpose of guiding me when I get into a pattern like this. So checked pattern can be a little hard to follow because the stitching blends in really well. And that's nice and clean and looks good, but it can be a little tricky navigating when we're in the midst of the alteration. All right, and as we're coming down into the seat, we want to make sure that we stitch directly over top, merging onto that original stitching. Because later when we pull that original stitching, we want to make sure that it stops there. Okay, this is awesome. Let's go on over to the iron and see how we did. We're ready to take out that original stitching now, and as I'm looking at it, I can see something really interesting. This is really common for pants, especially in the seat, because it's a really strong stitch. We've got a single needle, let's call it a cover stitch, but it's a chain stitch done on a cover stitch machine. And what that means is we can release this full chain of stitching all the way down to where we crossed over our new stitching on that seat seam just by cutting a few stitches on this side. Let's do 3 or 4. One side of the chain stitch looks like normal stitching. But then when we flip to the other side, that's when we can see that it's a chain stitch. And you see how it literally is unchaining as I pull it. And that should take us all the way down. And as long as you've crossed over and locked the stitching in place, good, it should stop right there. If it does keep going, be careful, stop, because it can run all the way into the crotch and open the whole seat. And then you may have made a little extra work for yourself. So just keep an eye on that guy. And then we'll pop up the stitching on the other side as well. That was the side that looked like normal stitching. Last thing to do is open a little bit of that stitching right at the edge here. Now we are going to be able to find out if we lined up our new stitching for the let out well. Let's find out. As I pull this apart, I'm immediately able to see, did my waist seams line up? Just barely. Ooh, they're just a little bit off. So we will probably just restitch that area and that area. I'm going to put a little pin in to see if I can help show you. This is where one waist seam is, and this is where the next waist seam is. So I really want those to match up perfectly. So we are just going to seam rip only between these two waist seams, leaving this connected and leaving the rest of the seat connected, and just make a little bit of a shift there so that we can get a nice perfect lineup. One thing that I'm going to show you before I go back over to the machine as well is how you can see the ridges from where the stitching used to be. This is something that you want to take into consideration, because though this will press out fine, in many suits, wool or cotton linen base are going to pull out just fine. If you are working with an aged suit or a corduroy suit, something that has a pile, that's going to end up being a little bit of an issue because you may not be able to heal those stitching lines. Dry cleaning is always an option. Steam is always an option. But keep this in mind when you're letting out a garment. Also, the age of the garment can affect whether or not you've got a difference in dye. You may let this out and find out that, that is a lot more red or a lot more blue than the outer sides that have been exposed all of those years. So just helpful hints to keep in mind when we're letting those garments out specifically. Okay, let's go make that little adjustment over at the machine. I've seam ripped just between the waist seams that I want to line up. So now I'm going to pinch them together and hold them in place where I want them to be, lining up these waist seams right there. So I'm going to line that up, hold that in place, and then flip to the inside and pin it. I like to pin it perpendicular because I'm trying to hold those horizontal seams in place, and then I'll check one more time before I sew it down. I'm also going to do that with the lower waist seam where the waist is connected to the seat. Just pulling out some little fuzz. There we go. And again, I'm going to place a horizontal pin directly through where I want that seam to go, and then check it out. Okay, let's see if we can hit those right in line, both of them one more time. We're starting back on top of our previous stitching from the seat because I liked how that turned out. We're just redoing this a little bit above. Ooh, I have a little bit of, great. And then I'm holding the pant a little bit at an angle because of course it's still completely attached to the pant. So the waistband needs a little bit of an arc as I'm feeding it into the machine because it can't sit completely flat with all of that construction still intact over here to my left. Alrighty. And you, of course, are welcome to re-chalk in this line. I just accidentally rubbed it off while I was working on it. And we're aiming to shoot to line right back up with that stitching that we had previous. There we go. And let's see if we got it. Awesome. Love it. Love it. All right, let's go press that now. We're back over here at the iron, and I've got my little ham here. This is the tailor's ham. What I love about this is the curve. I love to have a semi-flat surface with curved edges. This, in a lot of ways, mimics the different natural curves of our body, one of them being the seat. So as I'm pressing this, I'm gonna start with the inside. I'm gonna open my seam allowance as I'm bringing the iron in. I'm also gonna flip up that waistband. You see there? I'm flipping that out because we're gonna get everything good and pressed, and then we will fold and press the waistband back into its final resting place. And I am always kind of molding, especially while the fabric is hot, molding it into the position that I want it to be in. And then I'm gonna move up here to that waistband. And now we've only got this little bit of baby seam allowance. It's enough though. It's definitely enough, and this is gonna give that customer just the right amount of let out so that he can continue on wearing this beautiful suit. All right, let's flip that waistband back to where it will sit. And then I'm, again, molding and pressing while the fabric is warm. And then I'm gonna press that in place. Awesome. Let's flip to the other side. Now we're on the outside of the garment. And again, we're checking to make sure that that waist seam on either side is nice and lined up. Not just because it's aesthetically pretty, but it'll make sure that everything is sitting flat, smooth against the body exactly the way it's supposed to. And I'm gonna press that down the seat all the way almost into the crotch there. That's looking really nice. All right, the actual let out is complete. The only thing that we have left to do now is that stitch in the ditch that will re-secure the waistband and keep it from flopping up on him. So we're gonna throw a few pins in that over at the machine and get that secured. We're back over at the sewing machine for the very last time, and we're gonna take one pin and slide it through directly at the waistband seam where it meets the seat. That's gonna be our guide for our stitch in the ditch. Now, one really important detail about putting this stitch in is we need to have a really good matching color so that if the stitching is slightly visible, it will blend in really well. But also, we don't want to make it too wide. Like, we don't want to go from belt loop to belt loop. We really want to keep it 3 inches or less. It is just to secure the waistband, and if we have too much of a stitching line, it'll hold the pants in place in an odd, straight angle at a part of our body that does start to curve as it goes toward the hip. So, with all that said, let's line our needle up so that it's going to come down directly in that seam. And then we're just going to move really slow and catch that seam right in between the lines. Perfect. Awesome. Hopefully, that is impossible to see on this side and hard to see on the other side. That look familiar? Exactly the way that we started. All right, let's get one final press and take a look. One more quick press Gonna make sure that that seam allowance is nice and flat and not folded up or anything on itself. Give that waistband a good press and flip to the outside one more time. Then our last quality check is going to be, do the belt loops look equidistant from the seam? And do the pockets look equidistant from the seam? As long as they do, and everything's looking good, we are all set. Good to go. All right, questions, comments, anything that I missed, anything that you want to know, leave that for us below. And like, subscribe, and join us again soon. Thanks.